It's a big year for Matt Rhule and the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a year in which they are looking to take another step forward and get back to the road to relevancy in college football. I'm really excited about what this team has to offer in 2024, and we are going to take a look at that excitement, both short term and long term, in this deep dive. Before we do that, though, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like and share the video. It goes a long way in helping out the channel, it goes a long way in helping this deep dive series. It's been a really fun series to do, really dive deep into these teams and see which players are going to step up, which players are expected to contribute at a high level, and what we should expect for teams like Nebraska. So let's dive in. We start with Matt Rhule. It's been a really fun ride so far for Matt Rhule in terms of it. We've seen some obviously good things. We've also seen some not so good things. And this is where, if you're Matt Rhule, I think that you have an opportunity to do something special. And when you look at Matt Rule's last few stops, you look at his success at Baylor, you look at his success at Temple, you're looking at a guy who knows what he's doing. He is someone who has been a successful coach at multiple different stops. And on top of that, you're looking at multiple different stops where you need to turn programs around. And this is no different. It's just a different level than those other two programs. So turning around Nebraska, a program that has struggled in the Big Ten, is very different than turning around Temple, a team that is in the AFC. Turning around Baylor, a program that is in the Big 12, but maybe doesn't have that allure of Nebraska. So I think that Matt Rhule has his hands full for sure, and there's definitely ways that he can improve, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But a 5-7 season had a lot to do with the offense struggling mightily and a defense that did everything that it could to hold on for dear life. So you look at what the coordinators are in store for. Marcus Satterfield obviously disappointed. There have been some changes with that, so he's not the only guy that will be contributing to those play calls. Tony White is a very underrated defensive coordinator, someone who is very capable of being one of the best in college football. And that is going to say that's kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about with this defense. We'll look at the transfer portal real quick. Not a ton of added players to this roster, but I think they did a great job of adding quality players, is quality over quantity kind of approach for Nebraska. Because when you look at the players that they have, many of them are going to either start or be part of the rotation at their respective positions. Stephon Thompson coming in from Syracuse, he'll be a contributing linebacker, a very, very underrated addition by Matt Rhule and that staff. Isaiah Nair and Jamal Banks, the wide receiver position, is probably what everyone's talking about the most. Those guys should step up and be starters right off the bat. So even though you lose some players, and again, when there are a lot of these teams that you lost a number of players, but I don't know if you necessarily are losing sleep over it. Yeah, you probably lost a couple players that hurt, but also I don't think if you asked a Nebraska fan, they're not sad that Jeff Sims is gone. They're probably not sad that Choba Purdy is gone. So certain players just didn't pan out, and it was time to move on. And the staff has done a really good job of bringing in talent to elevate certain positions. And we'll just dive right into it. Probably one of the biggest surprises in recruiting that we've seen in the last handful of years was Dylan Railoa choosing Nebraska over a lot of our schools. Now, I know why he chose Nebraska, but it's still surprising that he chose a program that went 5-7 last year. Obviously, you get a chance to start right off the bat. You get a chance to showcase what you can do, but it's still surprising. It's not a bad thing. It's just, it was very surprising to see him choose Nebraska over some of the other schools that were pursuing him. And obviously, choosing Nebraska over Georgia was probably the biggest stunner that most people paying attention to recruiting saw. But again, the connection, the family connection, obviously we knew that was a possibility, and now he's here. Now, what should we expect from Dylan Raiola in 2024? This is an offense that struggled at pretty much everything last year. The quarterback position was a disaster for most of 2023. And at worst, I think that Dylan Railoa for Nebraska fans gives them hope for the future. Gives them, yes, he is a freshman and he's going to have freshman mistakes. He is going to have bumps in the road. And I think that people do remember that. And Nebraska fans should keep that in mind that there will be times where he looks like a freshman. He may look in over his head, but the potential is really what they're banking on. You see the arm talent, you saw it in high school, and the fact that he's already commanding the starting spot says a lot about his ability. Even with, the quarterback position being a weaker position for Nebraska last year and coming into this year, the fact that Dylan is able to take over the starting job says a lot about what future of this program looks like. And again, if this offense does not need to take huge leaps. They can just improve even into the 70s, the 60s at certain, running the ball was obviously pretty good for them, but also at the same time, you kind of had to run the football when you couldn't really throw. So there is a kind of an exception to that. Obviously, you're good, but this rushing attack is going to be fun. And there's plenty of depth at the running back position. Gabe Irvin and Emmett Johnson could be one of the best duos in the Big Ten at the running back position. These are two players that are set for big years. But again, the thing with this is you have to find balance. You have to have a passing attack that gets better and is able to move the ball down the field. You have to be able to take deep shots and connect on some of those deep shots because otherwise teams should just load the box and wait for you to try and make a play and make them respect your passing attack. Dylan Railoa obviously plays a huge role in that regard, but the rushing attack should also be just fine. Irvin and Johnson have solid size. Irvin's a little bit bigger at 6 feet, 220 pounds, but both are players that are set to have big years should this offense find a little bit more of that balance. Depth behind them, Dante Dowdle is coming in from Oregon. That was a great addition, if you ask my opinion, added to that rotation in terms of providing depth and guys that could step up. Dowdle and Ramir Johnson is back, a veteran who's been with this program for a while. So you have plenty of options. There's not a big concern about what this rushing attack is capable of doing. You just like to see one or more of these guys improve their production from last year. Obviously, some of that is on them, and some of that is on an offense that needs to find a passing attack, that needs to find ways to move the ball down the field through the air. And again, Rhule has a lot to do with that. And I don't blame Nebraska fans for being excited. I think that I'm really excited for what Dylan Railoa can do. You have a quarterback who, with a big arm, who's capable of moving the ball down the field. And when you look at the options that he'll have to throw to this year, it just adds to that excitement. Now, Jamal Banks, to me, is still one of the more underrated receivers in college football. He's a big body player at 6'4, 205 pounds, someone who can be a deep threat for this team. And again, this passing attack must find ways to be more explosive. Banks is definitely going to help in that regard. 653 yards and 4 touchdowns last year. Isaiah Nair didn't have a great experience at Texas, but his time at Wyoming showed that he was an explosive player. So keep an eye on him. Also, if he's able to stay healthy, that's really going to be the biggest thing there because if he can stay healthy, he's explosive. Same thing with Isaiah Garcia Castaneda. He is someone who we've seen explosive plays from. We've seen him operate really well in certain spots, and you have a group that has lots of potential. Again, health is probably going to be the biggest concern for that wide receiver position. Alex Bullock is a solid piece behind them, 221 yards and 1 touchdown last year. Malachi Coleman is an explosive weapon, 17.4 yards per catch in limited production. And Jalen Lloyd, a player who averaged 39.5 yards per catch. Now, again, that is on limited production once again, but that is someone who on just 6 catches turned that into 237 yards, and half of his receptions were touchdowns. So you have someone who can be explosive. If the guys in front of them either get hurt, are not getting the job done, Nebraska has options. You just need to see if they can handle that on a larger scale because Malachi Coleman and Jalen Lloyd have really explosive numbers, But what happens if you're on the field more often? Are you able to be as explosive as you were when your conditioning is being tested? That's going to be one thing to keep an eye on for this wide receiver group. But I really like the potential in that unit. Thomas Fidone II is back at tight end. That's a position to keep an eye on as well. Maybe not as explosive, but also could be on the reliable side of things. 25 catches last year, 260 yards, and 4 touchdowns for him. Behind him, there's not as much production, though the staff likes what they have in their two guys. So there's plenty of options for this passing attack. And again, this passing attack is probably the biggest X factor on this team. If you're finding a way, you could talk about the next group as well. But the passing attack, which encompasses so many of these units here, is really what's going to dictate how successful this group is. Because if you find ways to settle down and move the ball down the field like you're capable of doing, and you keep Dylan Railoa comfortable and you allow him to make plays and develop and learn what the college game is like, you're going to be excited about the results in terms of wins. The offensive line, though, is probably the other unit that you can talk about in terms of X factors. They play a huge role in this team's success. And Matt Rhule knows that. When you look at his time at Baylor and Temple, his lines were a big focus for him in these turnarounds. And if you're able to find some consistency with this group, then you're looking at a group that will fit into what he did at those two previous stops. The offensive line found their footing at those previous stops, and it was a big reason why this team, or those teams, I should say, were so successful. And it's not a lack of experience, because when you look at even the right side of the line is probably the most experience. When you look at Ben Scott, Micah Maskua, and Bryce Benhart, you have plenty of experience. Now, you want to see them elevate their game a little bit. Benhart has been with the program for a while, but I think at times fans have been concerned about his ability to handle elite competition. And we'll talk about the schedule in a little bit and who they're going to face. But that's the test you have in the Big Ten. You have so many talented players that you must face on a weekly basis. And the offensive line has to find ways to win. On the left side, you have a couple of, I don't want to say inexperienced players, but not as much experience as the other guys around him. You also have some inexperience. You have a kind of a good combination of younger players with experienced players there. So Turner Corcoran is someone with 30 games starting under his belt. Sam Sledge is a redshirt freshman that this staff really likes. And you have options behind them that are exciting. You just need to either see what they're capable of doing, if they can handle life at the next level, or are they just in over their head. So this is a staff that has really tested. They have challenged their roster to see what this team is made of, and if they can handle that kind of stuff, and you're able to handle life in the Big Ten and not get overwhelmed. Again, some of this young talent is really where that's going to be a concern. Are you able to handle that challenge? Are you able to take that step forward? And if the answer is yes, then this offense will be a much better group than it was in 2023. And that helps the defense that was very good in 2023. This is a group that carried this team week in and week out. And you return a lot of exciting talent that should keep them as a potential top 25 defense. The defensive line is set. There's really not any questions about who's going to be the starter. Ty Robinson is once again, which is really exciting. When you look at the guys around him too, you look at Jamari Butler. I think Jamari Butler is a guy who continues to fly under the radar, a big time playmaker for this Nebraska team, and a guy who is set to have another solid year. Nat Hutmacher is a nose tackle that will have another big year as well. You look at 8 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. You're looking at someone who's capable of disrupting opposing offenses on a daily, weekly, whatever you want, play by play basis. You have good size here. That's the scheme that they play. You have the two guys that are over 300 pounds. Butler's a little bit more the athletic type at 6'4", 245. But you're looking at a defensive line that's going to be a problem. And then it just comes down to depth. And there's solid depth, there's options. It's just what is the drop back of seeing one of these guys come off the field? What happens if you need to replace Robinson? What happens if Butler needs a breather? If you have options, Riley Van Poppel is an option, Cameron Lenhart, James Williams. You have guys that have various different levels of productivity, but what are they going to do if they have to be the guy? Say Robinson or Butler go down and one of those guys step up. The answer is probably yes. If you look at the track record of this coaching staff, you look at what Tony White's been able to do. This is the staff that is able to develop their players. They are able to get that defensive line to that next level because life in the trenches is not easy. Just as much as is it difficult for the offensive line to face the opposing Big Ten defenses, the Nebraska defense, the defensive line, has their hands full with some of the physical offensive lines that you will see in this conference. But I really like what this group has coming back. I think that they're very comfortable with what they have returning, and they are not really worried about too many of those challenges because they have the experience to compete at a high level. And that defensive line plays a huge role for the defense as a whole. Because if this defensive line it does what it did last year, and you're finding that you're capable of repeating that success or even better, elevating because I think that this unit has the ability to elevate their game even more. And that's terrifying if you're a team facing Nebraska. And that's also going to help, especially if early on, because I think the offense has a lot of things to figure out despite the potential. And if they need some time, the defensive line and the defense, I should say, as a whole, might have to step up and give them a little bit more time. That shouldn't be a surprise. That shouldn't be unexpected. And you have the right players in place to make that happen. It also helps the linebackers behind them. Now, this is a group that also returns plenty of experience. Javen Wright, John Bullock, MJ Sherman, three guys that are set at their positions, ready to showcase what they can do. Wright and Bullock had solid seasons in 2023. Sherman is stepping into the starting role as a newer face to that defense, a newer starter. But you also have guys behind them that give you great depth. I think that's the one thing about this linebacker group. Even if you're not sure about the ceiling, you have lots of options if you need to get a guy out, if they're just not cutting it, if they're tired, if they need a breather, whatever you need, you have options behind them. Mekhi Gabayer is an underrated player that could step up at the outside linebacker position. Stephon Thompson, we talked about him. He is someone who is capable of being a big time weapon for this defense at middle linebacker. I really like what he's bringing to this Nebraska defense. He did a lot of good things at Syracuse, a program that doesn't get a ton of recognition, and you're able to stand out enough to be recognized by this Nebraska staff, and they bring him over. Prince William Monmouth is another player that probably doesn't get the recognition he deserves. He's going to figure into that rotation with MJ Sherman, someone who I think has a bright future. It's just a matter of getting on the field. And then when you do get on the field, what are you going to do with your opportunities? Because you'll have plenty of opportunities to make plays in this conference. And the linebacker position for Nebraska has a lot of exciting talent. It's just a matter of can you turn that into production? You have plenty of options, you have plenty of experience. So there shouldn't be too many concerns about what that group can do. If there's a concern, quote unquote, for this defense, you could say that it's the pass defense, and the secondary is really where that's going to hit hard because while the front group can get to the quarterback and be disruptive, I think that there are going to be plenty of challenges presented to this secondary, and they have to find ways to answer those challenges, to answer those questions about is this group ready to handle the difficulty that this conference can produce. Tommy Hill's a really great player, 4 interceptions last year. I think that this staff really likes what he's capable of doing. Isaac Gifford's another experienced weapon for them, someone who's been around the program for a while. Marquez Buford is an underrated safety for me. A little bit more of that physical safety, maybe not necessarily that ball hogging safety that you maybe want on the back end, but still someone who is experienced and understands what this program is trying to do. Deshaun Singleton is coming back as well. Solid season for him, but he's looking to take a step forward. And then finally, Malcolm Hartzog, the other corner that will line up opposite of Tommy Hill. I think that the corners are fairly solid for Nebraska. It feels like they have good players at those positions, and you have two solid options. The depth is probably the biggest concern for that group because nobody has a ton of it in terms of experience. So you're looking at some big questions. Maybe Bly Hill, the St. Francis transfer, could be an answer at the corner position. Dwight Boodle II could be another option as well. So you have options. You just don't know the level of experience, the level of comfort that you have with that group. So that's probably the biggest concern for that defense. But again, Tony Wade does such a good job of calling plays, of getting his whole unit to play as one and get in position. So you have plenty of comfort knowing that you're in good hands. When you look at what you should be excited about versus what you should be concerned about, the strengths for Nebraska, this is kind of a balanced list, honestly, when you look at the levels of excitement versus concern. Defensive line and linebacker, no surprise there. When you look at running back as well, probably the one true strength of that offense, that's really what's going to probably determine this season. If your strengths outweigh your concerns drastically, obviously you feel better about that. If the quarterback position, if Dylan Railoa isn't the answer, or if he's just a freshman, I think Dylan Railoa could show a lot of good things, but also struggle at times, and that's going to affect what this offense is going to do. The wide receiver depth might be a concern in terms of I don't think anybody's questioning the experience level for the wide receivers or excuse me, the potential level for these wide receivers. It's going to come down to, can you put that into production? Are you able to, like I said before, you have explosive weapons, but can they be explosive on a larger scale? Can you get more receptions and still beat defenses like that? That's probably the biggest concern there. I don't have a ton of huge concerns with this team, though. Yes, there are concerns. The offensive line could be a concern, the quarterback position, wide receiver depth, the secondary depth even could be a concern. But I don't have a ton of concerns where I feel like you have to sound the alarm. Dylan Railoa is the X factor, though. That shouldn't be a surprise with what we talked about earlier. He's definitely capable of leading this team back to where they want to be. He's also a freshman that might need time to adapt. But we'll dive into the schedule because this is a schedule that is very, very, very favorable. Even if Nebraska has some troubles, this schedule does them a lot of favors. And it's a schedule where you could see them being undefeated heading into the Ohio State game on October 26th. That being said, UTEP game will be a win. I don't have any concerns about that. The Colorado game is probably the most interesting one because that's going to tell us first what is Dylan Railoa ready for? And then secondly, is this a team that is capable of being undefeated going into that Ohio State game? We're going to learn a lot about this Nebraska team in week 2. Northern Iowa is obviously going to be a win. The Illinois game is probably more difficult than anticipated. The Illini should be much better. At Purdue, Rutgers, and at Indiana should be 3 wins. If you are truly headed to where Nebraska thinks they're going to be, those should be 3 wins. So again, only 2 big concerns I have would be Colorado and Illinois, and I don't necessarily know if I would even call them big. First 4 games are at home, then 2 of the next 3 are on the road. So I don't have a ton of worries about what this team's capable of doing. Obviously, the Ohio State game is difficult, probably going to be a loss. I don't think that's going to be a surprise. The next 4 games, though, are really what determines how successful this team will be. UCLA will be a tough game. At USC is a tough trip. Wisconsin at home, and then at Iowa. 2 familiar foes that will give them plenty of trouble. So when you look at the ceiling, this is definitely a team that's capable of going 10-2. I think that the Ohio State game is a loss for sure. And I think even if things are going well, they lose at least one more game. So they're 10-2 is probably the ceiling for this team. The nice thing though is that the floor feels a little bit higher than it was in the past. I think that at worst you're 5-7, and that's if like you're losing to Rutgers and Indiana. Now Rutgers is a little bit better, but you're adding losses there where if things just aren't going right, but then you kind of have other things that you need to talk about. I think you're reaching more for that ceiling, a 7-5, 8-4 season than you are a 5-7 or 6-6 because of that schedule. This is a schedule that has a lot of favors for a team that is looking to build plenty of momentum. They have certain players that need to grow up, and they have certain units that need to elevate their game. But if you're a Nebraska Cornhuskers fan in 2024, you have plenty of reasons to be excited for what your team can do this year.